I am my own lawyer.
Malik said, standing alone before the bench, his hoodie frayed at the shoulders, shoes 2 sizes too big, backpack clutched like the last shield he had. The silent protest under the mural of his father, erased the night before, was now branded as obstruction of justice. The prosecutor barked about order, the judge wore a mask of ice, and suspicious eyes labeled him a troublemaker. His name was Malik Turner, 16 years old. No lawyer, no parents, just a black teenager standing before a system never meant to hear him. In their eyes, he was stubborn. In his, he carried his father's final lesson: don't use fists when you can use your mind. The room seemed to already hold a verdict, but the air shifted when Malik recited the law as if he were reciting memory. They expected silence. He chose to turn silence into argument, and from that choice, the true balance of power would shift. Until the end of this trial no longer belonged to the gavel, but to his voice. The courtroom doors creaked open, the sound silencing every whisper. All eyes turned toward a teenager walking in alone. No lawyer, no parents at his side. Only a worn hoodie, sneakers 2 sizes too big, and a backpack gripped tightly in his hands. His slow steps seemed to admit he didn't belong here, but he had no choice except to face it. His name was Malik Turner, 16 years old. He was charged with obstruction of justice and unlawful assembly after refusing to leave campus during a protest. But that morning, the court didn't see a protester. They saw only a black boy, lost in a place where even grown men hesitated to speak. And silence wrapped around Malik like a sentence already prepared. Case number 372C, the state of Georgia versus Malik Turner. The clerk's voice rang out. Malik stepped forward, his reply small but clear. Present. On the high bench, Judge Judith Halbert, a white woman in her 60s, sharp eyes hardened by 2 decades in juvenile court, barely glanced at him. To her, Malik was just another kid who thought holding a sign made him immune to the law. "Mr. Turner, where's your lawyer?" she asked, her voice flat. "Your Honor, I don't have a lawyer." Malik answered, eyes steady. "That is not an answer," Halbert cut in. "Why not?" "I requested a public defender, but no one has contacted me." The judge narrowed her gaze. "You mean no one has offered you help, not even a phone call?" "No, Your Honor." Malik's tone remained calm. From the prosecution table, Paul Dalton, polished suit, gleaming shoes, sprang up. His voice boomed across the room. "Your Honor, the defendant is clearly uncooperative with school authorities. This was no misunderstanding, it was defiance. He organized an illegal protest, ignored warnings, and caused serious disruption. We request an immediate trial, with no delay." Malik glanced at him but stayed composed. Halbert asked, "And what exactly was he? Protesting?" Dalton answered quickly. "A mural, Your Honor. The school removed an image of the defendant's late father, a civil rights attorney, but the mural was never officially sanctioned. Malik Turner occupied the hallway, held up signs, chanted slogans, and refused to leave until police were called." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Whispers stirred from the back row. Halbert turned to Malik. "Is this true?" "Yes, Your Honor." Malik nodded. "And why did you believe that was acceptable behavior?" He tightened his grip on his backpack, voice trembling but firm. "Because it wasn't just a mural. It was my father. It was part of us. They erased it without asking, without warning. It just disappeared." Halbert leaned forward on her elbows. "So you think you have the right to decide what justice is?" "No, Your Honor. I only wanted someone to explain why my father wasn't worth remembering." The judge sighed, unimpressed. "This isn't a philosophy class, Turner. This is a court of law. Here we deal in facts, not feelings." Dalton smirked. "Exactly. And the fact is, he caused chaos. Other students joined in, teachers were obstructed. The entire school became a spectacle." Malik interjected, his voice even. "I didn't shout, I didn't curse, I didn't touch anyone. I just stood there, the same way I'm standing here." The gavel struck hard. You will not interrupt this court again, Halbert snapped. Malik stood still, unshaken. Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. I'm only trying to be heard. Another wave of murmurs spread, smaller, heavier this time. A teacher fidgeted uneasily in the back row. A local reporter scribbled furiously in her notebook. The judge's face tightened further. We either proceed today or postpone until counsel is assigned. But if you insist on defending yourself, Turner, remember this. This is no stage. There are no protests here. Malik gave a slight nod. I understand. But his voice did not carry the resignation of defeat. It carried the breath of patience, the patience of someone who had waited for years just to finally be heard. The courtroom had yet to realize they were not simply witnessing a boy trying to avoid conviction. They were witnessing a young man willing to face judgment, with memory, with knowledge, with a fire that didn't need to shout, yet was strong enough to shake the four walls around them. As Malik stepped back and quietly took his seat, Judge Halbert's eyes flickered with a trace of confusion. She picked up her pen and scribbled something onto the note before her. If one looked closely, they might have seen her hand tremble, just slightly. It didn't take long for Prosecutor Paul Dalton to seize control again. He stood tall, his solid frame filling the space between the bench and the defense table, like a man too accustomed to being heard in rooms like these, especially when the ones across from him were defendants like Malik. Dalton did not look at Malik. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, his voice resonant as though the outcome had already been written, and he was merely reading the script aloud. Your Honor, Dalton began, do not let the defendant's silence deceive you. The actions that brought him here were not passive. According to testimony from school staff and security footage, Turner organized a protest that disrupted the normal functioning of Jefferson High. Prior to this, he posted calls on social media encouraging classmates to join, and when the principal repeatedly demanded dispersal, he flatly refused. Halbert gave no reply. Her face stiffened, her nod subtle, as if silently conceding the point. Dalton pressed on, turning each page of his file with deliberate emphasis, highlighting every piece of evidence. We also have proof that Turner remained inside the building after hours, without permission, to post flyers and prepare for the protest. This was not spontaneous. This was planned, intentional. And though that mural may carry sentimental value for him, emotion is no excuse for violating the law. We move for formal prosecution and a sentence with deterrent effect. Through it all, Dalton never once looked Malik's way. The boy seemed invisible. Judge Halbert clasped her hands, leaning forward, her voice dry. So then, a protest in a school hallway over a mural now becomes a charge of obstruction of justice, and the court must treat it as more than a mere disruption. Yes, Your Honor, Dalton answered firmly. She bent down to read the case file, her lips moving as if murmuring each line. Then suddenly, she looked up, eyes fixed on Malik. Boy, do you understand what's happening here? Malik sat up straight. Yes, ma'am, I do. You must remember, this is not a classroom. You may not turn this place into a stage. I know, Your Honor. You are not here to defend your father's honor. You are here to answer for your own actions. This is not a history lesson. This is the law. A heavy silence stretched, pressing like a stone wall. Malik lowered his voice, but his words were clear. Your Honor, may I speak one word? That simple request furrowed Halbert's brow more deeply than if he had shouted. She slowly removed her glasses, set them down, and narrowed her eyes. This court does not need lessons from teenagers. The words fell, not loud like the gavel, but cold like a slap of ice. No one gasped, yet everyone felt the shift. Chairs creaked. A reporter in the second row stopped mid-sentence. Malik did not argue. He did not plead. He only nodded and sat back. Yet his eyes never left hers. They did not blaze with anger, nor look away. They simply held steady, as if saying, I hear you, I see you, and I will not forget. That silence echoed louder than any defense. For in that moment, it was no longer about words. It was the plain truth. His voice had been denied the instant it rose. Even Dalton, so assured in his dominance, instinctively flicked his gaze toward Malik. And for a fleeting second, the boy's composure unsettled him. But he pressed on. Again, Your Honor, the school had no choice but to call the police. The defendant refused to leave, refused cooperation. We are not punishing an opinion. We are protecting order. Halbert gave a slight nod. And this mural, what did it say? Dalton looked down, reading slowly. Justice begins with truth. The words hung in the air, a challenge by themselves. The judge exhaled and leaned back. Enter it into the record. The court acknowledges the symbolic nature of the protest, but reiterates, no one, whether juvenile or adult, stands above the law merely because they believe their cause is just. She tapped her pen lightly against the bench, then turned back to Malik. You will remain seated as we call witnesses, and you will not interrupt. Understood? Yes, Your Honor. And so the hearing pressed on, flowing like a river, rushing past Malik as if he were just a stone tossed into it. The current pretended it had never been obstructed. Yet in the corner, Malik sat still, not enraged, not broken, simply unmoving, as though he had foreseen it all long before, when he was far too young to even set foot in a courtroom. He already knew. In some places, truth must wait its turn. And today, he would wait, but not forever. Paul Dalton rose again, his posture relaxed, as though he alone steered the entire room. His presence filled the space between judge and defense table, like a man too familiar with power, especially in courtrooms where defendants like Malik were treated as shadows. He did not bother to glance at the boy. His eyes locked only on Judge Halbert, as if the verdict were already written, and he was merely reciting the lines of an old play. Your Honor, he began, let us not be fooled by the defendant's silence. The actions that brought him here were not passive. As confirmed by staff testimony and recorded footage, Turner orchestrated a protest that paralyzed Jefferson High. He posted rallying calls on social media days beforehand, urging peers to join, and when the principal demanded dispersal, Turner refused time and again. Halbert gave no response, but her rigid face might as well have been a silent nod. Dalton flipped through the case file, his tone unyielding. We have evidence Turner remained after school hours, without authorization, to post flyers and prepare the protest. This was not impulsive. This was calculated, deliberate, and while that mural may carry emotion, feelings cannot justify unlawful conduct. We move for formal indictment and recommend a sentence that will deter. All that time, Dalton never once looked at Malik. The boy seemed erased from the air itself. Halbert clasped her hands together, leaning slightly forward, her voice dry. So, a hallway protest over a mural now becomes obstruction of justice, and the court is being asked to treat it as more than just a disruption. Yes, Your Honor. Dalton nodded. Halbert lowered her eyes to the file, murmured a few lines under her breath, then raised her head to look Malik straight in the eyes. Boy, do you understand what is happening here? Yes, ma'am, I do, Malik replied, his back straight, his eyes never leaving hers. You must remember, this is not a classroom. You may not use this as a lectern. I know, Your Honor. You are not here to defend your father's honor. You are here to answer for your own actions. This is not a history lesson. This is the law. A silence fell, thick and compressed like air pressed too tight. Malik lowered his voice, but it was clear. Your Honor, may I say one word? That simple question unsettled Halbert more than any shout could have. Slowly, she removed her glasses, set them on the desk, her eyes narrowing. This court does not need lessons from a teenager. The words did not fall like a gavel's strike, but like a cold slap. The courtroom made no sound, yet the shift was unmistakable. People shifted uneasily in their seats, and a reporter's pen froze mid-sentence. Malik did not argue. He did not beg. He simply nodded and sat down. Yet his eyes never left her, not angry, not fearful, just steady, patient, as if to say, "I hear you, I see you, and I will not forget." That silence thundered louder than any defense. For in that moment, it was no longer a matter of rebuttal. It was the plain truth. Malik's voice had been stripped away before it could even be heard. Dalton, always confident, instinctively glanced at the boy. For a fleeting second, Malik's calmness unsettled him. But he pressed on. "Let me repeat, Your Honor. The school was forced to call the police. The defendant refused to comply with orders to leave. We are not punishing an opinion. We are preserving order." Halbert gave a faint nod. "And this mural, what did it say?" Dalton looked down, reading slowly. "Justice begins with truth." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Halbert sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Enter it into the record. The court acknowledges the symbolic nature of the protest, but let it be clear. No one, whether juvenile or adult, stands above the law simply because they believe their cause is righteous." She tapped her pen against the desk, then fixed her eyes on Malik. "You will sit still as we call witnesses, and you will not interrupt. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor." And so the hearing carried on, flowing like a river, pretending not to notice the stone dropped into it. But in the corner, Malik sat silent, not angry, not broken, just still, as if he had seen this moment before, back when he was far too young to set foot in a courtroom. He understood. There are places where truth must wait its turn. And today, he would wait, but not forever. Memories surged back. The smell of old paper, the rustle of turning pages, his father's voice, deep, steady, soothing inside their small apartment whenever the outside world grew too loud. Malik was only 10 when he first sat across from his father at the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered case files mixed with reheated soup from the night before. It was there he learned his first lesson. Justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins at the kitchen table, in the words of a father who spent his life fighting for truth. At an age when his peers were still lost in comic books, Malik was reading deposition transcripts. His father, Malik Turner, didn't teach law like schools taught history. He taught it as survival. Every statute was not just words, but bricks in an armor his son would wear to face the world unbowed. Every precedent was not just a number, but a story about power, who held it, who abused it, and who was crushed beneath its weight. Malik remembered that last night vividly. The silence was broken only by the steady rain tapping at the window, like whispers of warning. His father looked more tired than usual, not just in body, but deep in his bones. Malik asked, "Why do you keep fighting if they never listen?" Marcus smiled faintly, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening, as if deciding how much truth his son could handle. "Because sometimes, son, the goal isn't to win right away. It's to plant a seed, so that one day someone else has a place to stand." He leaned down, gently pressing a finger to Malik's forehead. "And remember, never fight with your fists when you can use your mind to beat the system. That's where they'll never expect it." Now, sitting in the courtroom, Malik could almost feel that touch again. The world had erased his father from the mural. The school had painted over it as though it were a mistake, as if Marcus's voice had never echoed through those halls. The mural had once shown him teaching, one hand pointing to the word justice on a chalkboard, the other resting gently on the shoulder of a young black boy, so much like Malik that passers-by always stopped to stare. It was more than paint. It was memory. It was evidence. And now it was gone. Just like his father, killed in a car crash no one bothered to investigate. The accident happened just weeks after Marcus filed a lawsuit against the county police department for discrimination. Coincidence, they said. Nothing suspicious. And then they told them to forget. But Malik never forgot. From a young age, he stayed up late among stacks of files, long after his mother stopped urging him to sleep. He read court records like fairy tales. He taught himself to spot loopholes, to read between lines of testimony, to ask questions before answering. Each night he trained himself to see the world through his father's lens, where truth hid not in the surface, but in the spaces between words. So Malik brought no textbooks into court. The law was already etched into him. He sat there silent, while prosecutor and judge tangled words around him like vines. Yet he did not bend. Because Malik knew his moment was coming. They thought he was just a boy out of place. But for precisely those places, for the rooms he was told he didn't belong in, for the conversations they thought him too young to enter, Marcus had prepared him. Too young, too black, too quiet. That was how they saw him. But Malik was something else. The judge's voice returned, distant, like a fading radio signal at the edge of its reach. Malik did not answer immediately. He blinked, breathed deeply, and recalled his father's words. You don't need to shout. Just be present, so that when you speak, even your silence carries meaning. That was why, when Prosecutor Dalton dropped yet another stack of files onto the table, Malik didn't move. When Halbert glanced at him, irritation flashing in her eyes, he remained calm. He waited the way his father once did in every courtroom where people pretended not to see him. Waited the way truth itself always waits. Quiet, patient, sharper than anyone expects. Because when Malik spoke again, it would not just be the voice of a boy defending himself. It would be the echo of a man the system once tried to erase. Malik stood. His voice was not loud, not polished. It trembled slightly, enough for anyone listening closely to hear the weight of fear being swallowed down. Your Honor, he said, locking eyes with Halbert. Just 60 seconds. Please allow me to explain. Halbert didn't blink. She leaned back, raising her eyebrows as if listening to a broken record playing for the third time. This is a courtroom, Turner, not a place for speeches. You disrupted a school. You will not do the same here. Malik stood still for a beat, his lips parted, the words catching like a stone in his throat. But he no longer pleaded. He simply sat back down, each movement folding his pain into silence. Dalton leaned into the lectern, his voice slick as oil. Your Honor, this boy's little performance has already wasted enough precious time. I move for summary judgment. Halbert nodded. Motion granted. Begin closing statements. Quick, neat, clean. They thought that was the end of Malik's story. From the back row, a chuckle broke the silence. Someone muttered mockingly, "The kid thinks he's here to give some movie speech?" Another voice chimed in, derisive. "Adorable." The whispers didn't touch Malik. He only lowered his head, letting it pass. Because inside, he knew this chapter was far from over. That soft laughter at the back of the courtroom, small but cutting, told him his words were worthless before he even spoke. Malik didn't turn, didn't reply, but for the first time, weariness shadowed his face. Not weakness, weariness born of being ignored, judged before he could even open his mouth. Proceed. Judge Halbert rotated her chair slightly. Dalton cleared his throat, bending for his notes. Malik blinked slowly, then suddenly leaned forward, unzipping his backpack. The faint zip cut through the silence, making heads lift. He pulled out a thick plastic bag, pages aligned and sealed tight. He placed it on the table before him, clack, precise, deliberate. Dalton faltered, his voice breaking mid-sentence. What is that? Malik didn't answer right away. He looked straight at him, his gaze steady and stronger than any shout. Halbert frowned. Turner, what's inside? Malik spoke, his voice low but every word carrying steel. Documents, witness statements, constitutional excerpts, school board minutes, all tied to my case. Dalton scoffed, laughing under his breath. You prepared this? Ridiculous. It's irrelevant. He's a minor, Your Honor. This is nothing but theater. Malik turned to him, voice calm. Age does not erase truth. You call my actions impulsive. This file proves otherwise. Halbert stayed silent, her eyes flicking from Malik to the bundle. Her hand twitched as if to reach for it, then folded back together tightly. If it does not come through counsel, it cannot be admitted. I understand, Malik nodded, but it still exists. And when this trial ends, it will remain in the public record, whether anyone wants it or not. No one laughed now. The room was heavy with silence, not the artificial kind, but taut, like a string ready to snap. Malik was no longer asking permission. He was daring them to keep ignoring him. "Your Honor," Malik said, his voice now clear, sharp as silk turned to blade. "Let me speak one last time." Halbert narrowed her eyes, her hand lifting the gavel halfway. "Turner, this court—" "I understand," Malik cut in, not loud, but utterly controlled. "You've made your position clear, but with all due respect, I have not yet had the chance to make mine." The words hung suspended, not just a teenager's plea, but a declaration of presence. Everyone in the room felt its weight. Dalton snorted, derisive. "What next? This kid wants to read us the Constitution?" Malik turned toward him, unblinking. "I don't need the whole Constitution, just a few lines you seem to have forgotten." The air shifted, subtle, but undeniable. The boy who had been silent all this time was now taking control. "When I was 10, my father gave me a book of Supreme Court cases," Malik began. "I didn't understand most of it, but one case I never forgot, Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. Halbert crossed her arms, leaning back, her eyes watchful. Malik continued. "In that case, students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. They were suspended. But the Supreme Court ruled students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech at the schoolhouse gate." He paused, letting the words settle into the air. "I did not shout. I did not fight. I only sat beneath my father's mural, and when it was erased, I stayed silent. My protest was peaceful, yet I stand accused." The gavel in Halbert's hand lowered, but she said nothing. Dalton jumped forward, his voice rising. "This is not a law school debate club. He's twisting precedent." Malik turned back, his gaze steady. "I quoted directly, sir. Or would you prefer I move on to West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnette, 1943? The judge flinched slightly. Malik continued, his voice steady, firm. "In that case, the Supreme Court declared that students could not be forced to salute the flag or recite the pledge. Why? Because the First Amendment protects not only what you say, but also your right to remain silent." The court affirmed, "No official can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of opinion." This time the room was truly silent. No whispers, no laughter. Only the quiet spread of recognition. Halbert pressed her lips together, her finger trembling faintly on the gavel. Dalton furrowed his brow, groping for words, but stumbling. Malik lowered his voice, each word deliberate. "Your Honor, you said this is not a classroom, but if the law cannot be learned here, then where will it be respected?" The question was like a crack, soundless, yet splitting the heavy wall of the courtroom. Dalton opened his mouth to object, then stopped. Halbert stared at Malik, her lips parting slightly, as if drained by the weight of something she could not admit. "Turner," she finally said, her gavel quivering, "you are not a licensed attorney." "I never claimed I was," Malik answered instantly, missing no beat. "But neither were Tinker or Barnette. They didn't need credentials to know their rights." It was the kind of laughter that didn't need volume to cut deep, the kind that says no matter what you say, it will never be enough. Malik didn't turn, didn't react, but for the first time, he looked weary. Not weak, just tired of being pushed aside, judged before he even spoke. Halbert turned her chair slightly, her tone clipped. "Proceed." Dalton quickly regained his rhythm, clearing his throat as he flipped through his notes. Malik blinked slowly, then bent down and unzipped his backpack. The faint zip pierced the suffocating quiet, making everyone pause. He pulled out a clear plastic bag, thick with neatly stacked papers, as though prepared over months. He placed it on the table. Clack, the sharp sound cutting Dalton's words in half. "What is that?" The prosecutor scowled. Malik didn't answer right away. He only fixed his gaze on him. Halbert frowned. "Turner, what's inside?" His voice came, soft but firm. "Documents, witness statements, constitutional provisions, school board records, all of it tied to this case." Dalton scoffed, chuckling coldly. "You prepared that? Absurd. It's irrelevant. He's still a minor, Your Honor. Nothing but cheap theatrics." Malik turned toward him, calm. "Age does not erase truth. You say I acted impulsively. This file proves otherwise." Halbert hesitated, eyes flicking from Malik to the bundle. Her hand twitched as though to reach for it, then folded tightly against her chest. "If it doesn't come through counsel, it cannot be admitted." "I understand," Malik nodded. "But it still exists, and when this trial ends, it will remain in the public record, whether anyone wants it or not." No one laughed now. The courtroom fell into a new silence, not one of contempt, but of acknowledgement. Malik was no longer pleading. He was reclaiming his voice. "Your Honor," Malik pressed on, his tone calm but cutting like silk, turned to blade. "Allow me to speak one last time." Halbert raised an eyebrow, lifting the gavel. "This court—" "I understand," Malik cut across, not loud, but commanding. "You have made your stance clear, but with all due respect, I have not yet been given the chance to make mine." The words hung suspended. No longer the plea of a teenager, but a declaration of presence. Malik invoked Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969, the case where the Supreme Court affirmed students do not shed their free speech rights at the schoolhouse gate. He paused, letting the words echo, then continued with Barnette, 1943, where the court ruled no one could be forced to speak against their conscience. Malik quoted directly, "No official can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of opinion." The courtroom was motionless, not from fear, but from realization. This boy wasn't just citing law. He was living it. "Your Honor," Malik lowered his voice, "you said this is not a classroom, but if the law cannot be learned here, then where will it be respected?" The question fractured the room. Dalton pressed his lips, unable to find words. Halbert froze, the gavel trembling in her hand. "Turner, you are not a licensed attorney." Malik answered at once. "I never said I was, but neither were Tinker or Barnette. They didn't need degrees to know their rights." There was no applause, no cheering, but someone in the back exhaled sharply. In the front row, the court clerk stopped typing, her eyes wide. For the first time, Halbert truly looked at Malik, not with the eyes of judgment, but with recognition. He wasn't trying to win. He just wanted to be heard. Malik sat down, smoothing the file before him as if it were sacred ground. No smile, no triumph, only waiting. And the silence stretched on, not as weakness now, but as control. For the first time, he had taken back power, not from the system, but through the very law meant to protect him. At the back of the room, Lena Bryant, a young reporter, had only come to collect a few notes. To her, this was supposed to be another dull hearing. But when she heard the name Malik Turner, her pen slipped from her hand. It wasn't just a name. It was memory. Jacob Turner, the sociology teacher who once saved her from expulsion. The man who told her, "Everyone deserves a second chance. Not everyone gets to meet someone who believes they're worth one." Lena leaned forward, her chest tight. Malik's face was sharper than his father's, harder, but his eyes were identical. Quiet, steady, listening before speaking. When he quoted the law, when he asked, "If the law cannot be learned here, then where will it be respected?" She couldn't hold back. Tears fell. She left the courtroom, drove straight home. No hesitation. She had to write. That night, while most reporters filed brief, clipped summaries, Lena sat at her laptop, typing furiously. No edits, no flourishes. Just truth. The article bore the headline, "The Courtroom Where a Boy Taught Us Justice." She did not begin with legal jargon. She began with memory. He once told me justice is not loud. It is patient. It listens. And sometimes it waits in the back row until someone brave enough reminds us why it must exist. The story spread. By morning, over 400,000 shares. By noon, more than 1 million. Twitter overflowed with screenshots of his quotes. Civil rights attorneys called Malik the voice of a generation. Former students of Jacob Turner filled the comments, heavy with pride and grief. At the center of it all were the words, "A boy taught justice." Public opinion shifted. Local TV stations that had once ignored the case now scrambled to cover it. Commentators questioned why Dalton had pursued prosecution so aggressively. Legal analysts dissected Malik's arguments on national broadcasts. And suddenly, the courtroom that had once felt like a cage became a stage. The system had nowhere left to hide. Outside the courthouse, people began to gather. Not in a noisy protest. Just standing together in silence, holding signs bearing Malik's very words. They remained there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. No shouting, no blinding banners. Only waiting to see what would happen next. In her private office, Lena found a small slip of paper placed quietly on her desk. Just 3 words. He saw it. No name, no signature, but she knew immediately who it was from. And in her heart, she understood. He was proud. Meanwhile, in her chambers, Judge Judith Halbert slammed her door shut. The heavy echo rang against marble walls. She strode to her desk, where case files sat in neat piles, except for one pulled from the archives. Its label read, "Jacob Turner vs. City Board of Education." She hesitated, then opened it. Jacob Turner's face appeared, sharp in old photographs. A name she had forgotten, but words he had left behind now rattled her courtroom like a silent explosion. Inside the file were notes, written in a careful hand. If they block you outside, make them listen. If they won't see, make them look. But never shout. Speak precisely, so they cannot refute you. Judith swallowed hard. That was the same calm fire she had just seen in Malik's eyes. Her own words from hours earlier echoed back. This court does not need lessons from a teenager. How bitter. Not just words, but a belief she had carried her entire career. She sank into her chair, exhausted. Not the exhaustion of the body, but of decades of hearings she had called order, which were in truth verdicts that silenced the powerless. Dusk spread across the window, purple light falling over the old file. She whispered, almost afraid of her own voice. What if all this time I've been punishing the wrong people? A knock at the door. Her clerk stepped in. Judge, Lena Bryant's article is going viral. The headline is, "The Courtroom Where a Boy Taught Justice." The door closed. Judith opened her laptop. Malik's name, face, and voice glowed back at her through Lena's words, like a beam of light breaking years of shadow. At the bottom, thousands of comments. One stood out. He made them listen without raising his voice. That is true power. Unbidden, Judith remembered. At 16, her strict father, a lawyer, had taken her to her first trial. A black man dragged in for loitering near a school. He had been polite, begged to explain. The judge dismissed him in under 3 minutes. Her father said, "See, that's efficiency." Now, after decades, she heard it differently. Not efficiency, erasure. She flipped to the last page. A photo of Jacob Turner standing before a classroom, white chalk in hand. On the board, "Don't fight with fists. Use your mind to beat the system." Words that now lived again through his son. Judith stood, walked to the mirror. For the first time in years, she looked past the robe, past the seat of power. She saw a woman who had spent her life enforcing the law, but had never asked, Who does this law serve? Her voice cracked into a whisper. What if I've been silencing truth all these years? She sat back down, picked up her pen. Questions poured out like a dam breaking. When does discipline become denial? If a student must teach us justice, is the system still fair? How many voices I've dismissed were in fact the truth? Then she wrote clearly, "The people ver Malik Turner, reconsideration." Tomorrow she would return to the bench, not as the same judge, not as the same person, and certainly not with the same silence. The next morning the courtroom hummed, not with noise, but with heavy anticipation. People leaned forward, sensing something different. When Halbert entered, the bailiff didn't need to strike the gavel. Silence was already there. She walked more slowly, shoulders heavy, her eyes less sharp, but truer. The woman who once dismissed Malik Turner with a glance now stopped, looked him squarely in the face, and spoke words no one expected. "This court," she hesitated, "will give the defendant one last chance. Turner, you are permitted to speak." The room held its breath. Dalton shot up. "Your Honor, we're in the closing phase. This is entirely irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Dalton." Halbert's voice cut firm. "I said the boy will speak." Malik rose. His fingers trembled, but his shoulders stayed straight. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but each word struck like a stone against glass. "I never wanted trouble," Malik said, his eyes sweeping the courtroom. "I only wanted to preserve the memory of my father, a man who gave his life to the law, not to break it, not to exploit it, but to believe in it and to teach it to the next generation." Those who had mocked him hours earlier now held their breath. They erased my father's face without warning, as if his work meant nothing, as if we meant nothing. Malik drew a shaky breath but pressed on. When I stood at school and refused to let them erase his name, I did not shout. I did not throw anything. I only stood, silent, until they dragged me away. The murmurs spread through the courtroom. Dalton began to squirm, irritated. Malik turned toward Judge Halbert. "But didn't Martin Luther King say, 'Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere'? If a student defending history is treated as a criminal, then perhaps we should ask, who is truly the threat?" Dalton shot up, voice sharp. "Objection! This is a political speech!" Halbert didn't look at him. She looked at Malik, and her voice softened. "Go on." Malik pulled a folded sheet of paper from his backpack. But he didn't need to read. Every word was already in his heart. "I've been studying law since I was 10. Not in a classroom, but at our kitchen table. My father made me read Tinker v. Des Moines, where the Supreme Court ruled students don't lose free speech rights at the schoolhouse gate, then West Virginia v. Barnette, where the court declared no one can be forced to bow to what they don't believe." Malik lifted his gaze, meeting Halbert's eyes. "So when you say this courtroom is not a classroom, I only ask, if we cannot learn justice here, how can we expect anyone to respect it out there?" A sharp intake of breath came from the back row. Dalton was frozen. Halbert, too, was silent. Then suddenly, she stood. The gavel in her hand remained suspended. "I have worn this robe for decades," she said slowly, "and too often I have mistaken silence for order. Today, a boy reminded me that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is the sound of truth being buried." She turned to the clerk. "The charges are dismissed. The record will be cleared. Turner is free." Gasps swept the room, followed by a lone clap, then another, then more. Not loud, not jubilant, just steady, respectful applause. Halbert raised her hand to quiet them. She looked at Malik once more. "This courtroom will no longer be where wisdom is, buried. Never again. Thank you, Turner, for reminding us what justice must truly be." Malik did not smile, did not nod. He only drew a deep breath, his chest rising for the first time without weight crushing down. As he stepped down, a woman whispered, "That boy just changed everything." And she was right. For this time, the trial did not end with the strike of a gavel. It ended with a voice, from a 16-year-old black boy who had taught a room full of adults what justice meant. The hallway outside was transformed when Malik emerged. Where once tension had hung thick, now silence held steady, like the walls themselves were holding breath. Malik stood at the door, backpack slung over one shoulder. The echo of applause still lingered in his chest. Then a voice rang out. Hoarse, aged, but so familiar it froze him. "Malik?" He turned. Before him stood a tall man, broad-shouldered, darker-skinned, nearly 70. A weathered face, a trembling hand clutching an old hat. Elijah Turner, Jacob Turner's younger brother, Malik's uncle. The man who had vanished after the funeral, after the threats, after the mural was painted and erased. They had never seen each other since. I wasn't sure I should come," Elijah stammered, voice thick. "I thought I had no right." Malik said nothing. He let his backpack fall and stepped forward, embracing him. The hug was not casual, not polite. It was the kind that said, "I missed you. I needed this. You still matter despite everything." Elijah trembled, holding tighter, whispering, "I was a coward. Your father." He spoke out, and me. I stayed silent. I told myself it was to protect you, but the truth is, I was afraid. Malik pulled back, eyes wet but blazing. "You were here today. That's enough." A few steps away, Lena Bryant stood frozen. She hadn't expected to cry again, yet tears streamed down. The scene was not just a reunion. It was legacy, passed from Jacob Turner through Malik to everyone Jacob had once saved. That day, a boy had turned a courtroom into the largest classroom and made the world sit down and listen. Lena clutched the printed article under her arm. Its edges crumpled from being held too tight. She had seen a circle close, the man in the mural, the lessons he once taught, and now his son carrying that flame into light. A boy had entered the courtroom under the shadow of his father's dream, and then turned it into reality. Lena raised her camera, snapping one more photo, not for the paper but for herself. A reminder that justice does not always come from verdicts. Sometimes it comes from a moment, an embrace, forgiveness, or a boy daring to remember who he is, even when the system wanted him to forget. Malik looked around the hallway, saw Lena, saw his uncle Elijah, saw faces now nodding, smiling as they passed. And for the first time that day, he let the tears fall. Not from fear, not from pain, but because finally, someone truly saw him. The next morning did not begin with applause or headlines. It began as it always had. Malik pedaling through quiet streets before dawn, cold wind cutting his face, backpack swaying at his back. But when he turned onto the street leading to school, everything was different. The mural had returned. Not just restored, but expanded. Beside the image of Jacob Turner teaching justice to black students, a new painting stood. Malik in the courtroom, Constitution in hand, one arm raised, not in anger, not in defiance, but in clarity. His painted eyes were steady, understanding, as if the artist had been there, listening when the room fell silent after his words. It was more than remembrance. It was a promise. At the same time, Judge Halbert submitted her resignation. The paperwork was brief, but her letter carried more weight than dozens of rulings. "I spent my life demanding respect for the law. Now, I want to spend what remains helping others understand it. I no longer wish to sit above to enforce silence, especially when that silence erases someone's voice." She accepted a position teaching legal ethics at a small community college, where no one was required to stand when she entered. She said, "This time, I want my audience to listen because they choose to, not because they are forced." Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office launched an internal review of Dalton's past cases. Many files revealed evidence of overcharging, coerced testimony, and a clear pattern of bias against black students. Dalton was suspended indefinitely. He refused interviews, dismissing the pressure as irrational public hysteria. But everyone knew the pressure wasn't baseless. It was born from truth. As for Lena, her article, "The Courtroom Where a Boy Taught Justice," surpassed 3 million reads. She was invited on national television, offered book deals. She declined. Instead, Lena went to Malik's school, stood in the auditorium where the mural had once been covered, and read her article aloud. Students sat in silence, some with tears brimming, some clenching their fists, not out of anger, but as if they had just been awakened. Malik didn't answer reporters. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he accepted an invitation from the National Human Rights Initiative, a fellowship for young activists. They gave him mentors, opportunities abroad, and above all, time. Yet every morning before he began his day, Malik still rode past that wall, not for pride, not to check on it, but to remind himself of his father and of the man he was becoming. No applause followed him there. No cameras trailed him. Sometimes the janitor nodded at him from afar. Sometimes a teacher paused and whispered, "Thank you." And one morning, a little girl with braided hair stood staring up at the mural. She turned and asked Malik, "Is that really you?" Malik smiled, parked his bike, and sat beside her. "That was me," he said softly. "But now, the law belongs to you too." They sat together in silence. Not the kind of silence that erases, but the kind that opens space for what comes next. Because justice does not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes, it enters with the quiet footsteps of a teenager who refused to bow to smallness. And that wall remained. This time, not because of any policy, but because it was guarded by memory. The story of Malik Turner reminds us that justice does not always thunder through gavels or long-winded verdicts. While Judge Halbert carried a career built on power and silence, Malik, with nothing but his father's memory and a few lines of the Constitution, made an entire courtroom listen. On one side stood the arrogance of law forgetting humanity. On the other, the persistence of truth, soft yet strong enough to transform a trial. This lesson is not only for Malik, or for those who sat in that courtroom. It is a reminder for all of us. A human voice only truly disappears when we stop daring to raise it. And sometimes, the smallest voices leave the greatest echoes. If you were Malik in this story, would you have the courage to stand for justice? Do you believe a single quiet voice can change an entire system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so together we can continue spreading stories of truth and courage.